In 1915, Babe Ruth had a breakout season, and I'm convinced that if the Rookie of the Year award had been around back then, Ruth would have easily taken that award. As the 1916 season approached, the question was, would Ruth encounter a sophomore slump, or could he build on his stellar rookie season that saw him win 18 games and post an ERA of 2.44? The Red Sox organization had to be excited. They were coming off a World Series championship the previous season. They had a loaded starting staff, and they had a 21-year-old stud in Babe Ruth, who during the previous season proved to be the second most difficult pitcher in the league to get a hit against. The Red Sox optimism was warranted as Ruth would dominate batters in 1916. Leaving us with the question, if the Cy Young Award had been around in 1916, would Ruth have taken the award? Well, let's start here. Ruth tossed 9 shutouts in 1916. He was the only lefty in all of Major League Baseball to do that between 1901 and 1932, and he was the only American League lefty to do that until 1978, when Ron Guidry matched that. In fact, Ruth and Guidry still hold the American League record for most shutouts by a left-handed pitcher, and there have only been 5 lefties in the history of baseball that have thrown 9 shutouts in a season. Carl Hubbell and Sandy Koufax, of course, are Hall of Famers. Ron Guidry, well, he's got a pretty good case for the Hall of Fame, although I doubt he ever gets in, and John Tudor was masterful in 1985. Well, Ruth is one of 5 people in this elite club, and that says something about what a special season this was. While none of us were around to watch Ruth in 1916, some of us were around to watch Ron Guidry in 1978, and it's kind of interesting to see their numbers side by side. Ruth and Guidry both led the league in a lot of categories, but here's 7 categories that they shared. Besides the 9 shutouts, look at their ERA. It's virtually identical. I watched Ron Guidry in 1978, and I remember how dominating that slider was. It makes me wonder what hitters thought in 1916 when they watched Babe Ruth. Nobody's saying Ruth had the blazing fastball or the wicked slider that Guidry had, but apparently he had the stuff that could get the job done. In fact, his stuff was so good that as we try to figure out who's pitcher of the year in 1916, it comes down to a 2-man race between Ruth and the big train, Walter Johnson. Johnson won 417 games in his career, and as we looked at in the previous video, he would have been a runaway winner for the Cy Young in 1915. But with the emergence of Ruth, that was not the case this year. Let me just state this right up front. Trying to figure out who would have won the AL Cy Young Award in 1916 is a crazy difficult decision. In fact, I'm totally convinced there's no way we can know by just looking at the stats. We would have had to see these guys pitch to actually make a decision. And even then, I can only imagine all of the debate that would have occurred after a decision was made. Out of 26 major pitching categories, between the 2 of them, they led the league in 19. Ruth led the league in games started and shutouts, but Johnson led the league in innings pitched in complete games. Regardless of what metric you look at, Ruth led the league in ERA, but Johnson led the league in WAR. Ruth led the league in hits per 9, meaning he was the most difficult pitcher in the league to get a hit against, but yet Johnson was the most difficult pitcher in the league to actually get the bat on the ball against. You can see this is really close. Since these guys led the league in virtually everything, I thought it might be helpful to see how one compares against the other as the league leader. Ruth led the league in 9 categories, such as games started with 40. You can see that Johnson only had 2 less, comes in at number 3, and that's kind of the case with everything. Of the 9 categories that Ruth led, Johnson's in the top 10 of 8 of those, and Johnson led the league in 11 categories, with Ruth finishing in the top 10 in all 11. While Johnson was the league leader in WAR, Ruth came in second. You can see that this isn't helping a whole lot. As I kept trying to settle this, I thought, well, let me look at the Triple Crown stats. Between Ruth and Johnson, they led the league in all 3. Johnson led the league with 25 wins, Ruth came in third with 23, but Ruth led the league with ERA of 1.75, and Johnson came in third. Johnson also led the league in Ks, and of course, Ruth came in third. I also came up with what I call a somewhat modern take on the Triple Crown. Whereas Johnson led the league in wins with 25, you can see with these advanced metrics like adjusted pitching wins and win probability added that Ruth actually leads Johnson in both of those categories, meaning maybe Ruth should have had more wins than Johnson. And since Ruth was the ERA leader, I thought, well, I better look at ERA+. Ruth is the leader in both of those. And with Johnson being the strikeout leader, I thought it might be helpful to look at the strikeout-walk ratio. Johnson leads that as well. Here are some of the major statistics that neither one of them led the league in. Whereas Johnson has a slight edge in things like whip, Ruth has an advantage in win-loss percentage. And overall, Ruth appears in the top 10 on 6 of these, whereas Johnson's in the top 10 in only 4. Since trying to decide who should win the Cy Young is so difficult, I thought, well, let's just look at their head-to-head battles. Ruth was 4-0 against Johnson in 1916. Personally, I don't know if this means anything. Baseball's a team sport, so take it for what it's worth. I have to admit, while I was working on this video, I kept thinking Johnson had a slight edge, but as it came down to the wire, I was swayed in Ruth's direction. Here's why. Here are the facts. Johnson threw more innings, and he threw more complete games. And if you like high-octane pitchers, then Johnson's your guy. He even has a little bit better control than Ruth. His whip's a little better, and his WAR's a little better. But Ruth threw 6 more shutouts than Johnson, and he was the most difficult pitcher in the league to get a hit against. He was also the most difficult pitcher in the league to score a run against. And while Johnson had more wins, the advanced metrics actually favor Ruth when it comes to wins. The bottom line for me is a pitcher's job is to prevent people from scoring runs and to rack up wins. And at the end of the day, Ruth has the edge in both of these. So very hesitantly, I'm giving Ruth the Cy Young, with Johnson being a very, very, very close second. And I found a couple folks who agreed with my decision, so that always makes you feel good. Well, that's it, and I appreciate it when you like and subscribe.